welcome to what promises to be a particularly intriguing episode of ETCIO LeaderSpeak. Intriguing and profoundly enlightening. On this episode of ETCIO LeaderSpeak, we are going to be talking about quantifying the ever elusive return on security investment. I'm Sneha Jha, editor of ETCIO and your host for the session. And my guest today is a stalwart from the security industry. But I'm not revealing his name just yet. Let me first set the context for our conversation. Now, the rise of digital, cloud, data, hybrid work culture, distributed enterprise, platform play, and API economy have catapulted security to the forefront of technology investment. Security is being infused into the infrastructure, applications, identity and access, platforms, supply chain, and even at the product level. Sure, CISOs are expanding the value of security beyond hard payback figures and strict ROI calculations. But is value like beauty in the eye of the beholder? To some extent, maybe, but for the most part, no. CISOs are faced with increased pressure to prove the ROI of their investments. You might argue that the value and impact of security is difficult to capture in numerical terms. The tried and true most important test for business, ROI, is hard to determine for security investments. But this attitude is a no-go before the management. Business executives believe that security cannot be exempt from ROI calculations. And they insist on hard payback figures. Their logic is that you absolutely need a method for accurately calculating your return on security investment so you can assess whether your security strategy is meeting the goals of your department and your organization. And if it plays out in your favor and increased investments are necessary, you can ask for additional budget, how you wish. But the process of calculating return on security investments should be practical and should deliver on reliable and actionable results. Your metrics should be easy to gather, relevant to your business and the risk it faces, and relatively accurate. To get a more of a practitioner's view on this, we have with us industry stalwart Rajesh Thapar, CISO for Axis Bank. Mr. Thapar, welcome to ETCIO LeaderSpeak. Thank you for taking out the time to be with us today.
Thanks, Neha. It's my pleasure to be here.
Mr. Thapar, at Axis Bank, how do you maximize business risk reduction and threat prevention with the right investments in your enterprise security budget?
So the expectation from a CISO or the InfoSec professionals today is that you create value in the system or preserve value in the system. So is something which is important. And both of them relate very well to the investments. Say if you invest in something, if either you want to create value so that it increases, or you should be able to protect that the value is not depleted or is actually lost. So that is where is the essence of investment coming in. Particularly the investment is not always for profit. It is also for the loss reduction. And the information security is per se going with that mindset. The objective is not only while we do support the business to grow, we do handhold them to come up with robust products and get the digital buy-in from the ecosystem partners and participants. But the more important area also is that we prevent the losses. The finite set is the budgets. And every organization is today struggling to get the infinite budget. So it's primarily proportional to the revenues of the organization. How much are they able to put out in the ecosystem? What is that number? Is a finite number. Now, how do you manage it? You are seen as another business unit by the leadership. The first important thing is do a risk assessment, which is quantifiable. Now, what do you mean by quantifiable? Is something we need to know whether we can put a tag to it, which can be in the dollar terms, or we just maybe put a qualitatively quantified rating of a vulnerability or an asset or a risk. That's important to decide, where are my risks? What is my exposure? What is the impact does this particular exposure create in the ecosystem? So it's important to do that quantified risk assessment of the environment. Know what your risks are, have a prioritization of that risk. That it's important to know your risk, know what are the inherent risks that are living in the system, what are the compensating controls that are there, what is the residual risk that you are living with. That decides up to here, that decides where you will be investing. So investment is again not the same risk appetite would be for every organization. For every organization, you have to decide on what is your risk appetite. As a bank, I may have a risk appetite which will be different than a peer bank or another organization. So it's important for the security leader to define its risk appetite and spend according to the risk appetite, so that at all point in time, the residual risk is less than the risk appetite. Now, how do you quantify it is a $1 million question, to be honest. It is again quantified in a qualitative way, because we can't estimate the probability of compromise. We can only have a guesstimate of it. There is no perfect answers for what is it that when will things go wrong. You can only have indicative numbers, indicative metrics, believing that you have enough compensating controls in place, which reduces the probability of exposure and all that stuff. Another area which is important when you are actually discussing all that or putting all these things in place is, don't have a prevention bias, because in today's terms, prevention is not the only thing that you should be concerned on, or protection. You need to be believing that, one, I know all my risks. I try to protect all my risks against all the vulnerabilities, assets, but I need to be ready for if things go wrong. Where is it that I can channelize my energy to detect, respond, and recover? So all the energy of cyber security professionals are going into becoming more a cyber resilient professionals. Cyber resilience is the way forward, wherein you should be able to withstand if things go wrong. So the investments, whatever are in the budget, have to be allocated in all 5 pillars of the NIST framework in that order. I mean, you may decide, some organization may decide to put in investments in identify or knowing all your risks. It all depends on the maturity of the organization, what stage it is. But it is important that you allocate resources in each of those legs depending on where your exposure lies. 2 elements which should always be taken care in this is, one, the time. How quickly do I need to mitigate? Because there will be risks on the table. I have prioritized it. Do I have a time window of 1 week, 10 days, 1 month, 1 year? What is the time window that I can live with that risk? So that will be a contributing factor to decide on what I need to fix now, what I can leave it for later. Second key element when we decide on our priorities of protecting the information ecosystem is that don't be carried away with serious incidents, just investing on serious incidents, because the serious incidents are usually rare and hard to quantify. It's not easy. Say serious incident, the probability of that would be maybe once in a decade. But the regular daily incidents, which may be a compromise of your cyber hygiene, can happen on an ongoing basis and can lead to significant potential issues. So it's important that you balance out what can go wrong, have everything on with you through that risk assessments, prepare your gap sheet, prepare your strategy, decide on what you want to invest in with the mantra of containing the exposure.
So you really, like you mentioned, need to contain the risk exposure, and you really need to have a very firm focus on assessing the risk appetite of your organization and the risk prioritization. As banks become more and more digital, there is a need to have a focus towards serious financial loss, the data theft, compliance risk, like you spoke about, the loss of trust that could come from damaged relationship with customers, and also extended downtime. So you need to be mindful of all of those facts as you try to do your risk prioritization. Now, as a segue into your response in the first question, I would like to understand from you, how do you go about putting a numerical value to how safe your organization is or how vulnerable it is? How do you assess the state of vulnerability of your organization?
Okay, this is actually a very, very difficult thing to quantify everything, because arriving at a quantified numeric value is not easy. I mean, because in security, it's just not putting a number to one set of vulnerabilities or one set of indicators somewhere. This is a complex mathematical model that you will have to evolve, wherein you give weightage to all your basic controls, to your compensating controls, to live with your risk. What is it that you are investing? What state are you in today? And then you arrive at some numbers. But on a high level, I believe all organizations typically have a set of KPIs and KRIs. The KPIs for the performance indicators, but more from a risk indicators perspective. The KRIs would actually decide upon what is the number it ends up with. So the KRIs can be per se from your attack surface perspective. It can also be from the performance of your various tools, or it can be the threats which you are seeing. So all that will come in, or the incidents that have happened in the system, or incident which you have blocked. So all that numbers will have to give a weightage to each one of them, put in the adequate controls. If I am a banking industry, for me, confidentiality, integrity, availability, all would be important. But if I am, for example, I'm a broking or an exchange house, I would be 100% more weightage, not 100%, but the larger weightage will go into availability. Broking houses or exchange houses cannot be down. For them, confidentiality is important. The integrity is important. But for them, that leg is much more important. So same thing for us, depending on the asset type, you will have to decide what is in the earlier parlance of ISO standards, you have CIA. You have to give a quantified qualitatively. I mean, again, I use this word very commonly because you can't quantify your C or I or A in perfection, with perfection. You will have to put in either 3, 4, 5 or some weightage of it. And depending on what is the purpose you are doing that assessment with, put those ratings there, arrive at a weighted average model. On that, it depends on if that asset is a public facing asset or servicing my customers. I would go with a high availability as a higher weightage. Then I would go for my internal asset, which may be critical as well. So it all depends on what is the purpose of that particular asset. You arrive, you create a model for that, put in the adequate numbers, values into it, have a weightage of what is the inherent risk that you're living with, what is it with some investments that you will be able to reduce, and be ready with that. The second thing which is very important in all this is, do you have visibility of your attack surface? Because in today's terms, the attack surface is going beyond the typical traditional perimeters. So today, it's no longer that somebody has 2 firewalls up there and primarily an endpoint physically located at a particular place, and you believe that everything is contained. But in today's terms, I mean, your perimeters are gone. It's from your supply chain, what you were initially mentioning as part of introduction. Supply chain is actually a big contributor of the third-party ecosystem is getting integrated with you. Your
Yes, and
people
we've
are
seen that
working.
with SolarWinds.
Yeah, exactly. Your people are working from home. So your attack surface is actually going everywhere. Maybe it's important that you have a visibility of outside in view through a service provider. I'll not name any of these service providers. The industry can always look out for them. But there are service providers which give you outside in view perspective. And that they also give you a weightage of to each of those layers, which is endpoint, which may be browser, which may be applications, which may be all that controls. They give you a definite weightage of it, and they give you a rating. That rating is something which you can benchmark against your peers, your other industry partners, and also gives you what you need to correct. So that is a ready-made implicit or mentioned, rather explicit mentioned number, but the implicit issues that are observed in their particular attack surface. So that is something which I believe is important. to subscribe for. Again, preferences can be for any one of them to pick up whichever they want to. Third thing, which I believe which will give a reasonable number or reasonable value to your maturity of your security controls, is a threat intel that you get. The threat intelligence will actually indicate to you what is the number of, suppose your ID credentials are compromised, or card detail is available, or any other information that is coming out from the dark web or deep web. That gives you an indication what is the maturity. End of the quantification that we are thinking of is just to be sure on the maturity of our cyber practices. Are we aware of everything? So all these issues which are outside in, and their internal tracking of vulnerabilities, of your assessments, of your vendor risk issues, or number of partners which are vulnerable, each of them would actually contribute to arriving at that number. I mean, that number is, again, you can't compare a number arrived in one organization with another organization, because there are all guesstimates and estimates.
Right. Now, do you think security is too big and too complex for ROI calculation, since you've mentioned some of these ground realities on why it is difficult to put a numerical value to it? Is it a misnomer to have a return on security investment? Is ROI in security a misnomer?
I'm not sure if it is a misnomer, but it is a necessity. I mean, it's a necessity that you need, because the people who are the guys who take call on security, other than the information security function or the IT function, are not the technical guys. They don't understand the technical jargons. So they need to translate all what is to be done or where you stand to a number. And all the investment that is being put in the system has to show out some returns. That returns can be, again, in the form of either that's enhancing your product or bottom line, top line, and all that stuff, or it helps you contain those losses which eventually could have happened, right? So it is, it may not be, I should say, security is big, but it's truly getting complex. The number of variables that are coming in are just too many. I mean, as I was just mentioning, so internal itself, the asset inventories are expanding. The API ecosystem is actually making it much more complex. The partner ecosystem is making it much more complex. The lot of the cloud going on cloud is another variable that is coming in, wherein you need to have visibility of everything sitting at one place. So you will probably need to decide. Identities is another thing. Earlier, the identity used to be only of the user. Today, the identity can span forward to devices, to your applications, to everything else. So all these are actually making it much more complex. So that is something which is leading to the ROI or ROSI are making it very, very complicated models to come up with. The very, very common thing which all the risk professionals would have thought of is single loss expectancy, which means if things go wrong once, what is the loss of, what is the quantum of loss that can go in? Then the other element which comes in is the annual rate of occurrence. When can it happen? The probability of this going wrong, or the annual loss expectancy is arrived at. So all these things decide the ROSI, return on security investment. But the important element in this is the mitigation factor, which is, I also see that if you arrive at these return on investments before you have actually invested in technologies, or protecting technologies, you may end up with abnormal returns, which may actually downplay, because you have not estimated it right. You may go with an abnormal return on particular investment, and which may not be the right calculation. So end of the day, we will have to keep learning, keep evolving, and hopefully there will be some models. There are tools which are available which gives you a quantified number, but to be honest, I am not a firm believer of just seeing those numbers, except that when it is required for cyber insurance. It's much easier to quantify that for a cyber insurance, because that's only on productivity. But for rest of the things, if things go wrong, there are a lot of variables, a lot of interplays that happen, which I believe there is still time to cover for the entire business.
Right. So as you're saying, there are a lot of variables and a lot of other factors that come into play, and it's hard to find a statistically valid ROSI with hard numbers and metrics that can then prove. Most of it is reactive. What, according to you, then are the various nuances of the calculation of ROSI? How can CISOs develop a means to educate the executive management without resorting to the fear, uncertainty, and doubt paradigm?
I think awareness plays a big role there. It's very important that you make the stakeholders aware on on what the risk is. The impact is understood by all the stakeholders. Because if there is a concurrence, if there is communication and collaboration amongst the stakeholders, then everybody would take the risk at the same value. That is something which is the bottom line. If you have to make that percolate in the ecosystem, the culture, the risk culture, the cyber culture. Second part of this would also be on the risk assessments that we just mentioned on. Third is the strategy. So if you define your strategy right, you have put up your strategic plans in place, then you have only to implement it. The effort which goes in is only at the time when you have got your budgets, you know your risks, you map out a strategic plan, have the priorities in place, and go with it. So arriving at a strategic plan is somewhere where you have to apply the ROI model or a ROSI model. The positive side here would be all the investments that you would have made earlier. By at least over a period of time, you have to keep reassessing how much returns did you get. So it is not only success of breaches that would be there. It is also important is how much of the investments have ended up blocking some of those attack vectors. That is something which you can go back and inform that this is something which could have materialized. This is the impact of it. So you are not only too proactive, you are also taking the reactive feedback into your model and going back to the leadership. The other element which is very important in this is that you speak the language of business, because that is a basic disconnect that is typically there. It's not you speak technical jargons and, oh, my WAF will go down or DDoS will happen. What is the impact in the business terms, in the financial terms, is something which will have to be measured. If there is a DDoS, if there is a productivity loss, how many people will not be able to work, put a quantum number of that, how many infrastructure components will not work, what is the revenue loss that you would have take all those, put a formula, arrive at that number. If it goes on for 3 days, this business model not available for 3 days would end up at this loss. This loss is something, are we ready to bear? Or if we have to mitigate it, this is the investment that's coming in. Are we able to correlate these two is the question. Again, coming back to your question of what are the nuances of all this, I think one of the key nuances of, rather two key nuances is, one is estimations. That you have to make estimation on the probability of compromise and the potential loss. There's no mathematical way. It can only go closer to, depending on all the controls that you have. And many of times these controls with basis which you arrive at the probability are all tabletop exercises, wherein you keep feeding in and keep arriving at a number. The second key failure, I should say still a failure because you can't map it, is the non-availability of reliable actuarial numbers. So like you get in insurance, you get in a credit risk, you know you have invested this much. At the most, what you will lose is what you have invested. You will not lose anything beyond it. For any entity, if I have given a personal loan, I know at the most that is the number I lose. But in security, the number of the loss that you would have, you can never estimate, because that loss is not confined to that particular item. It's just getting expanded left, right, center. And there are no models which are available. The easiest model that are available today for the cyber insurance companies is an estimation on a revenue loss or a productivity loss, basis which, if your infrastructure is not available for a particular set of days, this is the cyber insurance that you need to take, or this is a cyber premium that you need to pay. So those things are still available. But if I think of a holistic model, I think it's difficult because of the non-availability of incident data. Because if one organization has faced that data, he will not share the information with any central body.
Can you offer some hard and fast do's and don'ts to CISOs on how they can develop robust and substantiable ROSI numbers? Do you have any interesting and enriching experiences and anecdotes that fellow CISOs can relate to?
One, learn from others' mistakes quickly, because you don't have to wait for your own thing to go wrong and then you learn. Second, don't go with the FUD. The more important thing is that you know what matters to you. Go and trust your own risk assessment rather than just, because there are a lot of products, a lot of vendors are coming in and probably selling it out. So have a model for yourself. What are the risks that matter to you? How do you quantify it and how do you make it happen? Where I feel the CISOs primarily, and that's something which I feel I have learned, is prioritize your risk and be an influential and a negotiator in the system. You should be able to negotiate. Because if you just put your foot down and say, well, this cannot work or that cannot work, and it's 100% it's a risk. You are there to manage risk, not to avoid risks. So that is something which is a very important thing I would leave my peers to be with.
Those were some very nifty tips and tricks on that are rooted in ground realities of the security landscape. Now, I'm really curious to understand from you that with the changing dynamic, the changing threat landscape, the changing business environment, the changing business demands, how do you change the parameters or the criteria to ensure that your ROSI framework keeps pace with whatever is happening around you?
Two things which again you will have to be careful of. One is the risk assessments. So that risk assessment is something which has to be continuous. It's not a point in time check that you have to, so that you know your top gaps which are important for you to arrive at your ROSI or defend your all your controls that you have in place. So that is something which should be continuously being looked at. For example, there were vulnerability assessments which used to happen. No, those vulnerability assessment ideally used to happen once in year, once in 6 months, then once in a quarter. Today they are happening on the fly almost every day. You have a cloud asset, it gives you a full-time visibility. So how do you make sure that most of these ecosystem things are giving you a visibility in near real time? And basis that near real time, you are getting a visibility of what is going right or what is going wrong in the ecosystem. So your model is there, which will arrive at your CIAs and what potentially a productivity or loss can be. But depending on incidents happening anywhere else, the threat intel that you may receive from any other ecosystem partner or any subscribed entity, that will give you a visibility on what is potentially the focus area for you. And if that matches to your risk assessment, your gap assessment, you know where the focus is. The ecosystem is changing so often that you have to be ready all the time with the ammunition to assess every partner that's coming in at the time when it's onboarded. Not only just being relying that I have onboarded a safe partner, just have a continuous assessment on that. Maybe apply attack surface visibility on your partners as well. So just keep replicating that, have that subscription of various parameters, gather that actionable intelligence and replay that model, reassess that model. Feedback mechanism is very important. It can be your own internal incident, it can be external incidents.
Thank you so much, Mr. Thapar. You gave us a practitioner's view and shared some battle tested procedures on how to assess ROSI. It's hard to quantify the value of something that does not happen, but I'm sure with some of the tips and strategies that you spoke about, the CISOs in the community will also benefit from some of the strategies that you've developed for it. Thank you so much for taking out time to be with us on this episode of ETCIO LeaderSpeak.
It's a very good topic to pick. I mean, per se, I mean, it's something which a lot of academic world is working on. I know a lot of PhD theses are happening actually on quantifying the cyber risk. But this quantification model, I think it may evolve. It may come as close to as it can be. It can help decide the maturity of an organization, but it will never be an element which can predict a loss in a cyber world.
Thank you so much once again for being a part of this episode of ETCIO LeaderSpeak. I hope you found this episode with Mr. Rajesh Thapar as enlightening as I promised at the beginning of the show. Thank you so much for watching.